Welcome to our first series of historical talks for the Church of the Immaculate Conception. I'm delighted today to welcome Brian Crowley, who is the Collections Curator at Kilmainham Jail and the Pearse Museum. And we're very fortunate to link up with Brian to discuss the life of James Pearse, and in particular his connection with the Church. So I'm looking forward to this. Over to you, Brian.
Okay, thanks very much, Roisin. I'm delighted to be able to do this. So I'm going to be talking about James Pearse, who I suppose is most famous as the father of Patrick and William Pearse, but also led quite an extraordinary life in his own right. But what I'm hopefully going to concentrate on in particular is how that, I suppose, extraordinary life influenced his sons, and in particular Patrick. And actually, we're going to begin with Patrick and his autobiography. So towards the end of Pearse's life, he began an autobiography which he ultimately abandoned. But it's a really, really fascinating attempt, I think, by Pearse to try and put a shape on his life, or to, I suppose, explain, I think, what was going to happen in the future in terms of the Rising, to contextualize it in terms of his own story. But he spends a lot of time in the fragment that does begin with, in the fragment that does survive. It's largely focused on his childhood and his family background, and there's a lot actually about both his parents. So I'm just going to start with this section here. He describes, as I said, his father and mother's background, and he concludes by saying, "For the present, I have said enough to indicate that when my father and my mother married, there came together two widely remote traditions, English and Puritan and mechanic on the one hand, Gaelic and Catholic and peasant on the other, freedom loving both, and neither without its strain of poetry and its experience of spiritual and other adventure. And these two traditions worked in me and fused together by a certain fire proper to myself, but nursed by that fostering of which I have spoken, made me the strange thing that I am." Now, I've always been very fascinated by this phrase, the strange thing that I am. And what's wonderful about our collection in the Pearse Museum is we have the actual manuscript of this unfinished autobiography. And you can see in this manuscript, I suppose, almost the thought process behind Pearse's attempt to, I suppose, create himself through words. And when you look at that line, you see that originally he had written, "which I have spoken made me an Irish rebel." And he crosses that out and he replaces it with the much more, I suppose, troubling, but also much more complex and interesting, "the strange thing that I am," suggesting that this kind of mixed heritage that he had, the son of an Englishman and an Irish woman, was something that he struggled with on occasion, and certainly felt it was something that set him apart and made him different and, as I said, a little bit removed from the society in which he grew up. And I think, if for no other reason, then the life of his father has to be a very significant part of trying to understand the complexities of Pearse as a man, but also the complexities of his own identity. So, as I mentioned, in terms of the autobiography, there's actually quite a lot in it about Pearse's father's childhood. And he was born in London on the 8th of December. So the 8th of December was his birthday in 1839. He was born in Bloomsbury. And although Bloomsbury is now a very kind of exclusive area of London, then it was much more mixed. His family were quite poor. They lived in a garret, so in kind of some attic rooms of a house in Bloomsbury. Patrick describes his grandfather, who was also called James, as a frame maker. He said that he had a strange artistic vein breaking out in him in spite of his mechanic occupation, a gift that might have been a torment and a glory to him, but for the sense of humor and the contentment of spirit which kept him sane and sweet, his religion being to honor his wife and lovingly to fashion beautiful things of wood which none would buy. James had one older brother, William, and a younger brother, Henry. And interestingly, he named one of his sons William, and P.H. Pearse, the H in Patrick's name, is he's called after his uncle. And apparently when Pearse was a child, he and his siblings would kind of delight when James told them about his childhood and how often they had so little money that they would dine as a family off a single rasher. James appears to, however, be very proud of his humble origins, and it seems to have been quite a happy home. Years later, he wrote to Patrick's mother saying that it is only when we have lost our own home forever that we can fully realize its value. For my own part, I am sure the happiest part of my life was spent with the old folks at home, but that is all past and gone. And interestingly, again, Pearse kind of shared that love of home. He was someone who's in many ways only really felt particularly relaxed amongst his own kind of family circle, or later among his pupils in St. Enda's. And when James was 7 or 8, it would seem that they decided to move as a family to Birmingham, which was very much an up and coming city at the time. And it was referred to as the city of trades. So in contrast with places like Manchester, which were very heavily industrial and were centered around things like the cotton industry, Birmingham specialized in kind of precision engineering. There was a big gunsmith industry in the city. So it meant that the working class there tended to be more skilled, and with that skill came, I think, probably a greater degree of confidence in themselves. And these images of Birmingham are actually magic lantern slides from the Pearse family's own collection. So these were James Pearse's own collections, and you can see here lots of kind of municipal buildings, but also, you know, the city library and museum. And there was a big emphasis in the city around the idea of self-improvement and giving access to the city's population to kind of higher learning and access to kind of culture and other intellectual pursuits. James apparently was initially apprenticed to be to work in a chain factory, but that didn't work out when he apparently he may have punched his employer. Also, he had some formal education, but it would seem to have been quite limited. He did go to the local Sunday school as well, and apparently his questions to the clergyman who was running the Sunday school led him to be labelled an atheist, which Patrick added he subsequently became. So from the beginning, he seems to have had a very complex relation with organized religion. But interestingly, he also began to, I suppose, educate himself. Pearse wrote that of his father that he had a deep thing moving in him, for he had the plastic fingers of his father, with in addition something of the fiery vision that called for expression. He studied art in a local art school and then went on as an apprentice to a sculptor. Patrick then said that he would work in the daytime and in the art school every evening. He read books by night and came to know most of English literature well, and some of it better than most men who have lived in universities. And James Pearse then becomes part of this movement, which develops among the working class, particularly in Britain at the time, where working class men and women kind of begin to demand access to learning, and they go to these evening classes that Pearse mentioned to educate themselves. And there's a very clear sense that within this movement that they realize that knowledge is power, and they want to democratize knowledge. And you get the development of things called mechanics institutes, which will run these evening courses, and actually museums play a very significant role in this as well. And in many ways, the function of museums is to provide popular access to education and learning. And James Pearse from the beginning starts to collect books. And again, we're very lucky in the museum that we have a lot of the books that he he had. And he favored books that were very well illustrated. And you can see how these illustrations then become important as he develops his trade, because as Pearse mentioned, he was apprenticed to a stone sculptor or carver. This would have been kind of commercial sculpture. So, you know, when he describes himself as or when Patrick describes him as a sculptor, he's not I suppose, an artist in the sense that we would understand it, but perhaps more accurately a craftsman. But this is an example of one of the books that James Pearse owned. This is a collection of the illustrations of Gustave Doré. This is his illustration for Paradise Lost. But he's incredibly erudite in his interests. So we have this book, The Inquisition and Judaism by Carlos Vero, which was published by a Jewish publisher in London in 1845. And it's an account of an anti-Semitic sermon preached by an archbishop in Portugal at an auto de fe in 1705, and a response to that sermon by Carlos Vero, where he kind of takes on the terrible kind of anti-Semitic stuff that were being said at this auto de fe. We also have this book, The Natural History of Animals by Karl Vogt. Apologies for my pronunciation. And he would have been, I suppose, following in the kind of the Darwinian tradition in terms of natural history. So what's remarkable about the books is just to have the sheer range of books within the collection. There's literature, there's history, there's a lot of ancient history, there's a lot of contemporary history as well. Around this period as well, it would seem that James Pearse also became interested in, I suppose, radical causes. One of the people that I suppose is most influential on James Pearse is a man called Charles Bradlaugh, who is a politician, and he is, I suppose, a British Republican. So I think you might say that Patrick Pearse was first introduced to republicanism in the form of Charles Bradlaugh. So Bradlaugh, like James Pearse, as I said, was from a working class background, was initially a soldier. He actually served in Ireland as a soldier in Ballincollig. He was stationed in Cork for a while, but he became interested in politics, and he actually stood as an MP and was elected for Northampton. The other thing that he, I suppose, was involved with was the secularist or free-thinking movement. He was an open and committed atheist, and actually ran into trouble as an MP because at the time MPs were obliged to swear an oath of allegiance on entering Parliament, and they had to swear by the Bible, something which Charles Bradlaugh did not believe in. And also they had to swear their allegiance to the monarch. And again, Bradlaugh was a committed anti-monarchist. But as I said, this admiration of Bradlaugh was something which stayed with James Pearse all his life. And in fact, some of the last letters that Charles Bradlaugh that received, or actually it was a letter that James Pearse wrote to Bradlaugh's daughter, and in it he said that no man other than his own father had influenced him more than Bradlaugh. So it's really interesting they have this kind of very radical background to James Pearse's life, and something again that was going to be problematic for him once he moves to Ireland in the late 1850s, early 1860s. So James appears to have been working in Dublin from 1857, but he may not have settled in Ireland permanently at that stage. On the 28th of April, 1863, at the age of 22, he married an 18-year-old girl from Birmingham, Emily Susanna Fox, at St. Thomas's Church in Birmingham. And in 1864, he is recorded as working for the Dublin firm of Early and Powells. And in December of that year, his first child, Mary Emily, was born in Dublin. So this is Mary Emily McLaughlin. She later married the son of a friend of his, who the McLaughlins were metal workers. They had a premises on Pearse Street, so they would have been kind of near neighbours as well. He also had a son with his first wife, James Vincent, who was born on the 19th of December in 1866. There were also two other children, Agnes Maud, who was born in 1869, and Amy Kathleen, who was born in 1871. Now, it would seem from the autobiography that Pearse was only aware that there was one other child who had died. And again, interestingly, Pearse mentions that that first marriage was not a happy one, and that James Pearse blamed his first wife for the death of at least one of these children. Which would suggest a very difficult marriage situation. Again, just to kind of give you a sense of this kind of life that James Pearse was living, certainly in the 1860s, where he's over and back from Ireland and England. In 1867, it seems he was involved this time as a wood carver, that he worked on the Queen's robing room in the Parliament in Westminster. Apparently, he was responsible for the carving of 26 princesses who adorn this very illustrious space. So it's kind of interesting that Patrick Pearse's father has some work in the Mother of Parliaments in Westminster, which his son did so much to separate Ireland from. Then in 1871, he's back in Ireland. He works on the Augustinian Church, the Church of St. Augustine and John on Thomas Street. So many of you may be familiar with this church. It's one of the more prominent churches on Thomas Street, just beside NCAD. And James Pearse is responsible for carving. There's 12 saints around the top of the spire. I used to say they were apostles, but it turns out they are not, because some of them are female saints, so definitely not the apostles. In 1873, he enters into partnership. So he goes out on his own with a man called P.J. O'Neill. And 3 years before that, James Pearse, his first wife, and their young family all converted to Catholicism, which I think was probably a prudent and nearly unavoidable move for an ambitious ecclesiastical sculptor like James Pearse, who was working in an overwhelmingly Catholic country. And it might be useful as well just to explain why he would have maybe moved from England to Ireland. Essentially, after Catholic emancipation, there's a church building boom in the country. Prior to emancipation, Catholic churches tended to be quite small, built in the back lanes. The church weren't really able to do anything particularly large or elaborate. So with, I suppose, the removal of restrictions around Catholicism, the church suddenly found themselves with this huge population which needed to be accommodated. And even if you look around the country today, like so many Irish Catholic churches, they all date probably from the second half of the 19th century, or certainly an awful lot of them. They actually worked out that there's a church built in Ireland for every week of the 19th century. There's that many of them built. So there's a huge boom, but there isn't the craftsmen in Ireland to work on these churches. So you get a lot of people, particularly from England, moving to Ireland. You get people doing stained glass as well. And, I mentioned the McLaughlins who did metal work, but you'd have had metal workers moving, craftsmen moving as well. And they would have been getting staff from England as well, just because, there was such demand and there wasn't really as much of a base here in Ireland in terms of craftspeople to support it. So, there were opportunities for an ambitious young man like James Pearse in Ireland at the time. And it's interesting as well, like if you look at Harry Clark, his family would have been part of that movement as well. So in July of 1876, James Pearse's first wife died. And as I said, it was an unhappy marriage. And very shortly after that, James Pearse started courting a 19-year-old girl who worked in a paper shop around the corner from his premises at number 27 Great Brunswick Street, what's now Pearse Street. Margaret Pearse, and you can see her here in her Sunday best. She was the daughter of a coal factor. Her grandfather had been a native Irish speaker from County Meath, apparently, who was evicted during the famine. The family continued to have kind of agricultural interests in Meath, and her father actually did quite well for himself and had owned a number of properties around the kind of around the north inner city, kind of around Ballybock, some of which she eventually inherited. So they began courting, but there was at that stage there would have been quite a significant difference in their age. But they married in 1877, and actually some of their love letters do survive, and you get the sense that certainly she's much more romantic about the relationship than he is at times. And at one stage, he actually apologizes to her. He wrote, "It strikes me I have not the power of writing so affectionately as you, but you must take the will for the deed sometimes. Anyhow, I think you know that I love you dearly and sincerely, and I tell you that you must not be doubting and fancying all sorts of things." So maybe it may have been partly the difference between somebody who was on a second relationship after a very difficult first marriage and a very young girl who might have had slightly more romantic ideas about marriage and love. So this is the Pearse family. Their oldest daughter, Margaret, was born in 1878. She was followed then by Patrick. You can see him standing there beside his mother. He was born in 1879. William James was born in 1881. You can see him there with just kind of beside his father. And then Mary Bridget, the youngest, was born in 1884. Patrick recalls his early memories of being a child in the basement of Great Brunswick Street, as it now Pearse Street, listening to the rhythmic tapping, which came all day from his father's workshop. And his parents' marriage seems to have been genuinely happy, though I think intellectually, I think there was probably quite a gulf between them. As I said, James Pearse appears to have been quite a erudite man with a real hunger for knowledge. Margaret was, I think, a much more kind of conventional, kind of traditional person, and didn't seem to share a lot of those interests. But Patrick also describes how when he was born, they occupied maybe one or two rooms in the building on Pearse Street. But as the family prospered, they were able to occupy more and more of the house. And eventually, just in his very early teens, they moved to the red brick suburbs. They moved out to Sandymount and lived in various houses around that area afterwards. And so, there's a real sense that it's a family on the up, that his father's business becomes more and more successful and they have more money. And certainly they go, I think, from maybe a more kind of lower middle class to certainly a solidly middle class existence as the children grow up. And certainly I think the second family have a much more prosperous upbringing than the first. The other thing I think is really interesting, these are two photos of the family, as you can see, taken on the same day. Margaret whips off her hat at one stage. But actually it's hats I want to talk about, particularly the hats of James Pearse. You can see in one of the photos here, he has a very kind of wide brimmed hat, almost like a cowboy hat. And then in the other, he has this almost Russian fur hat. So what I think is really interesting is they're slightly unconventional, quite, I think, slightly bohemian as well. And I think it's really interesting how he's using his costume to indicate that he's a bit bohemian. I don't know if it's like the equivalent now of having a ponytail or a tattoo to show that you're slightly, that you march slightly to the beat of your own drum. But as I said, James Pearse's interests remain somewhat bohemian, and he had a circle as well of bohemian friends. And Pearse describes how these artistic friends would visit the house and sometimes draw him. And Pearse talks about how they were very impressed by what a skilled model he was, that he was able to, as a young boy, lying in front of the fire, how he was able to hold himself very still as they drew him. But there is a sense that some of these figures, they remain somewhat shadowy. And you can imagine as well that Margaret Pearse, who's a very conventional, very pious, traditional Catholic, may have been wary of these, in many cases, secularist, anti-religion, anti-organized religion, certainly, visitors and friends of her husband's. And there is a sense that maybe she tried to keep them at an arm's length. Sorry, this is the quote here from Pearse talking about these people painting him as a young child. And it's very interesting as well, because Pearse has such a sense of himself and his body, and it's often a somewhat problematic relationship. But it's really interesting how, as a very young child, he almost basks in the attention that these artistic friends gave him as they sketched him naked, lying in front of the fire, which I think sounds a little odd to us now, but certainly I think was probably more acceptable in an artistic household at the time. So the other thing, I suppose, in relation to James Pearse's relationship with his children is in some of the letters that survive as well, he appears slightly fretful. So at one stage he's in London and he's writing to Margaret, and he's very concerned that there'll be problems with the gas, and he reminds her repeatedly to keep an eye on the gas and to make sure that the house is warm enough, that the children are dressed warm enough, that they don't get a cold or become ill. And it feels, again, a little over the top, but in many ways maybe that reflects his experience of losing two of his children in their early infancy. So he's quite a fretful parent. And I said, I think those early experiences affected him. And Pearse, in his autobiography, describes him as a loving, if somewhat distant father. He said, "My father came up to our room only once or twice in the day and at evening. When he came, our games were always hushed. Not that we were afraid of him, but by some old convention or instinct, we never made any noise once his white, stone, dusty figure had come into the room. He was big with broad shoulders that were a little round. He was very silent and spoke only once or twice during the course of a meal, breaking some reverie to say something kind to my mother or something to one of us. Otherwise, whether we were by ourselves or one of our rare visitors were there, sitting a little abstracted, always a little lonely, we thought, a little sorrowful at times, indeed. But these were very seldom. He would, in order to please my mother, rouse himself to exercise the wonderful social gift that he had. And then my mother's face would flush with pleasure, and we would laugh in pure happiness or join shyly in the conversation. Occasionally at night, when he was kissing us or when going away, the deep reserve in his nature would break down, and he would lift one of us very close against his stone dusty blouse. And these occasions were so few that I remember them one by one." So some really remarkable, I think, kind of description of his father and of his, I suppose, the family's relationship with him. Again, what's interesting as well is that kind of there's almost a suggestion of melancholia or maybe depression. Certainly, Pearse's sister Mary Bridget suffered from, I think, what we would now describe as manic depression, and Pearse himself was often a kind of a somewhat melancholic. And I think the other thing as well, you get that kind of sense of maybe social awkwardness or unease, or that just sense of reserve, which certainly Pearse had himself. The other thing that James Pearse provided was this incredibly aesthetically rich home, because the Pearse home was filled with engravings and casts of famous sculptures. I mentioned the Magic Lantern slide collection, and we'll be looking at that in more detail. And just, I suppose, work from James Pearse's own workshop was all around Pearse as he grew up. Certainly when they lived on Pearse Street, as I said, the premises faced out onto Pearse Street or Great Brunswick Street, but stretched all the way to Townsend Street, and they had a works entrance on Townsend Street. And the sculpture that his father's businesses were producing for churches around the country, like the church in Strabane, was all being produced there. So Pearse, compared to, I think, to a lot of other Irish people at that time of his class, had a much more aesthetically rich and stimulating environment. And this really shaped who Pearse was. So these are, a few examples of work from the family art collection. We're not entirely sure, of course, when these were acquired. So you can see there's the head of the Laocoon, which is a very famous sculpture. The full piece has Laocoon, who was the high priest of Troy, and his two sons being devoured by a serpent in the city of Troy. You can see here a set of engravings from the cathedral in Orvieto. And some of this art, I think, as well, had very kind of practical use within the family business. So we have a couple of examples of Leonardo's Last Supper. And that was really, the Last Supper, to mix my metaphors, was kind of the bread and butter, I think, of a lot of the work that James Pearse would have done, because obviously it's a very popular subject matter for altars. And this is, again, from a Magic Lantern slide. And what's really interesting is you can see the palette that it's resting on, and this was clearly taken in the works yard in Pearse & Sons before it was sent out to a church somewhere around the country. And again, you'll see these. Some of them will look very similar, and they may be by some other company as well. There's a very standard way of depicting the Last Supper, largely based on Leonardo's model. But then, these again are from the collection, the Pearse family collection, really fine engravings of, this is the Martyrdom of Saint Sebastian by Il Domenicino, the Birth of the Virgin by Carracci. These are really very fine examples of engravings. So you get a sense as well that the family are buying the very best that they can afford. And that, they really have a really good eye. We can also see how this kind of stuff will be very useful as well in terms of inspiring the work that they produce. And I suppose the other thing is James Pearse's amazing library of books is now accessible to Patrick and his siblings. And for example, one of the things that a lot of our visitors are really taken with is the fact that we have this early English translation of the Quran. And I don't think there were many houses in Ireland at the time where people would have access to something like this. So again, you see that for Pearse, this is a very stimulating environment. And he actually talks about this, about how in his biography he said, with every book that was read to me, with every picture I saw, with every story or song that I heard, I saw myself daring or suffering all the things that were dared or suffered in the book or song or picture. So all this stuff is really, I think, stimulating Pearse as a child, and, making him, as he said it himself, the strange thing that I am, but making him certainly very different. I think he has a very different home environment than a lot of the boys who would have been going to school with him in the Christian Brothers in Western Row. And again, in the autobiography, he describes himself in his imagination toiling across deserts in search of lost cities, cast into dungeons by wicked kings, starved and flogged by merciless masters, racked with Guy Fawkes, roasted on a gridiron with St. Lawrence, deprived of my sight with the good Kent. When I heard of anyone's sorrow or of anyone's triumph, I suffered the sorrow or enjoyed the triumph myself. And you get a sense in Pearse's description of his childhood of somebody who's living, for whom their imagination and reality are, almost interchangeable, that he lives as much in his imagination as he does in the real world. And, to have somebody like that who is so imaginative and so susceptible to stimulus, either written or visual, surrounded by all these riches, I think, is very, very significant. And so much of that is coming from his father. His father was, a big fan of Shakespeare, like Pearse himself. Shakespeare was Pearse's favorite writer. At a very young age, apparently Pearse went to buy a magic lantern machine. He bought a cheap one, which didn't work. And then his father for Pearse's next birthday, bought him a lantern machine. But this becomes a big part of the family life as well, and they start to give talks. So Patrick, I suppose, begins his oratorical career in the family home, doing these illustrated talks with magic lanterns, with magic lantern slide. This is something he continues himself in his school, in his work in the school later on as headmaster in the school magazine. There's numerous accounts of Pearse giving magic lantern talks to the boys. We also have many of the catalogues from magic lantern shops where he would have gone to buy the slides for different talks, and they're annotated, so we get a sense of like some of the talks that Pearse was giving to his pupils. And again, these are some from our collection. So Pearse, again, in terms of the stimulation, he's seeing images of Paris. This is the great exhibition in 1889 to celebrate the centenary of the French Revolution. The earlier one in 1855, images of Venice, Florence, London, and also, these images, I think this woman seems to be maybe an Inuit woman, don't know very much, a Native American man as well. James Pearse was particularly interested in Native Americans, it seems. We have books about, I suppose, the wrongs committed against, the injustices visited on Native Americans. So again, you have a sense that James Pearse is quite radical in terms of his views and his, I suppose, empathy and sympathy for colonized peoples around the world. And again, it's kind of interesting to see how that might have fed into Pearse. We also have, I mentioned earlier, a lot of images of Birmingham. This is an image of Stratford-on-Avon, the home of William Shakespeare, which is in the hinterland of Birmingham, and James Pearse was quite proud of that. And we have some of the notes from a magic lantern presentation that James Pearse made, and he refers to these slides of Birmingham and of Stratford-on-Avon. And as I said, Shakespeare then goes on to become Pearse's favorite writer. Pearse's pupil, Desmond Ryan, said that his only vice, he didn't smoke, he didn't drink. His only weakness was really beautiful collections of Shakespeare's work, and that sometimes, even when he was in financial difficulty, he could be tempted by a really nice set of Shakespeare's work that he'd see in a window. He said sometimes he'd walk away and then kind of return. He said he'd walk several streets away and then slowly return and buy the edition of Shakespeare that had caught his eye. And definitely, I think if you look at Pearse's writing, the influence of Shakespeare is really significant, certainly in terms of the oratory. If you look at the O'Donovan Ross oration from 1915 in particular, there's really interesting echoes of Mark Antony's speech from Julius Caesar, which was a party piece of Pearse's and something that he recited as a young man at public events. So again, a really interesting influence on James Pearse. So we're just going to move kind of quickly on just to have a look about the kind of professional life of James Pearse around this period. So in the 1870s, his business is really thriving. This is a pulpit that he did for St. Mary's Church in Athlone from 1878. And these carved panels here in the pulpit, they actually tell the story of the life of the Virgin. This was removed then in the 1980s. A lot of his work, as we'll see, was a victim of Vatican II, because he tended to, a lot of the work that he, I suppose the showstoppers rather, were also the things that were targets as part of the changes in the appearance of churches post-Vatican II, post the 1960s. So these panels are actually now part of the Pearse collection. The full pulpit would be about kind of 9 feet tall. So we took the panels and they're on display now in the museum. In 1880, in many ways, he enters one of the most fruitful periods in his career. He enters into a partnership with another Englishman called Edward Sharp. And this is really, this statue is of Aaron Gobraw. And it was commissioned by the National Bank on College Green in 1889 for their premises there. So for those of you familiar with Dublin, it's kind of opposite the big Bank of Ireland in the old Parliament House, and these days it houses Abercrombie and Fitch. But if you are going to buy your Abercrombie and Fitch clothes, if you look up on the roof, you can still see it up there today. This was the symbol of the bank. You can see here, the figure of Ireland. She's got her harp, the wolfhound again. These very obvious symbols of Ireland. And then in the background, you can see barrels, probably representing porter. There's sheafs of wheat. There's bolts of clothing. There's butter barrels as well. And the National Bank had been founded by Daniel O'Connell as an alternative, I suppose, a bank that wasn't controlled by Protestant and Unionist interests in Ireland at the beginning, in the first half of the 19th century. So you can see here, this is the symbol of the bank, and because they used to issue their own coinage. Of course, this one is from Belfast, so not coinage, rather their own currency. But this was a big commission, and a very public commission, and interestingly a secular commission, which is kind of rare enough because so much of their work was bound up with the church. This again is a very fine example. Thomas Duffy, who's written about James Pearse's work as a sculptor, cites it as maybe one of the most significant. You can see here, this is the altar of St. Joseph, and you can see in the bottom of the altar there the death of St. Joseph. We actually have a plaster version of this scene. It may have been the maquette for it, or maybe they made a plaster copy just to show the kind of work that they could do. And interestingly as well, I think the Magic Lantern slide collection contains images of some of these panels. So obviously it was something that James Pearse was very proud of. You can see here, these are Magic Lantern slides that were created for James Pearse. So obviously this was, a significant work for him. Interestingly then, in 1885, we have the Burke Memorial from Glasnevin Cemetery. Again, a very big commission. It's in what is referred to as the O'Connell Circle in Glasnevin. So it's they're the most expensive plots in Glasnevin, and it was created for Ellen and William Burke. And if we just go back here again, it depicts St. Patrick in Ireland. And again, what's interesting here is the attempt to create something that's maybe a bit more distinctively Irish, because a lot of the other stuff is very kind of almost, I suppose, generic medieval representation of saints. Obviously, the neo-Gothic style is in the ascendant in the second half of the 19th century, which is great news for people like James Pearse because it involves an awful lot of stone carving. Now, the success of Pearse and Sharp excites some, I suppose, jealousy from their competitors. And at one stage, it would seem that the son of his former partner, P.J. O'Neill, began a campaign suggesting to Irish clergymen that they shouldn't be giving work to these two Englishmen. James mounted a stout defense of himself and his partner. And this letter, again from our collection, was written to Archdeacon Canan of Fethard on the 31st of January, 1883. And he's responding to these criticisms of the church giving work to Pearse and Sharp because they're English and perhaps not Catholic. And he said, "I am bound to admit that we are both guilty of being Englishmen, but as God in his wisdom thought it fit to call us into existence upon the other side of the water, and as his will was done in this matter and not ours, we think there needs be no apology from us on that head." And then he goes on to talk about his conversion and includes a letter from Father Pius Divine of Mount Argus, who had overseen his conversion. And in the letter, Father Divine recalls James's sensible objections and difficulties whilst you were under instruction, and the clear-headed manner in which you saw the answers as soon as they were proposed to you by me. Indeed, I don't think I ever received a convert, and I received a good many, with whose disposition before and after reception I was so pleased with as I was with yours. However, the sincerity of this conversion remains quite suspicious, or certainly it's highly suspect. For James Pearse, it will have been financial, economic suicide to have appeared as being anything other than religiously orthodox. However, there is evidence to suggest that James Pearse was living that most Victorian of lives, a double life. In Ireland, he was appearing as a happy convert to Catholicism, married to an Irish Catholic woman, raising his children as Catholics. But over in England, which he visited very frequently, he frequently visited his family in Birmingham, and he also went to London quite a lot as well. It would seem that he was very much involved in the free thought movement. So the free thought movement is kind of like, I suppose the atheist anti-religious movement at the time. So in his accounts, we find at one stage it was actually in 1884, so a year after he's writing to Archdeacon Canaan, he's invested £50 in the Free Thought Publishing Company, which was headed by Charles Bradlaugh and Annie Besant. She was a pioneer in women's rights, and particularly in areas around birth control. And the publications produced by this organization did not merely challenge religious orthodoxies, they rejected and at times ridiculed many of the central tenets of Christianity. Such, I suppose, support of this organization, I think, was completely incompatible with even the vaguest religious, or I suppose the vaguest or lukewarm faith in a Christian church. There also exists in his accounts from 1889 to 98, an intriguing reference to suggest that James Pearse was more than just supporting them financially. That's the free thinkers. On the 4th of April, unfortunately no year is given, James Pearse records payment for printing something called Socialism and taking out adverts for this publication in Watts and the Free Thinker. And in the Agnostic Journal of May of the 19th of May, there's also a letter. On the 19th of May from either around 1888 or 1889, an ad appears for a pamphlet which was called Against Socialism, which is written under a pseudonym called Humanitas. So over the years, then I kind of have been tracing in free-thinking newspapers like the Free Thinker and the Agnostic Journal, pamphlets produced by Humanitas, many of which have not survived. So the actual texts, the pamphlets themselves, haven't survived in the British Library or any of the other places you would expect to find them. But there are enough of them that survive to suggest that whoever was writing these pamphlets was certainly very familiar with what was happening in Ireland. So in one pamphlet from 1883, Is God the First Cause? Humanitas is challenging the theories of an Irish Dominican priest and making specific reference to attending a lecture in Maynooth College given by a Reverend Gerald Malloy, the college's professor of theology. Again, he seems very familiar with Ireland in a pamphlet called The Follies of the Lord's Prayer, in which he mocks the Archbishop of Dublin, who is praying for good weather. There's also a pamphlet called Charles Bradlaugh and the Irish Nation. And I suppose for me, the most damning evidence, or not damning, but I suppose most convincing evidence to suggest that Humanitas may have in fact been James Pearse, comes in The Follies of the Lord's Prayer, where he makes reference to a clergyman called Mr. St. Clair, who was a vocal opponent of free thinkers and free thinking. And St. Clair was trying to, I suppose, explain, why does, if God is a loving God, why does he allow terrible things to happen? And St. Clair explains that the evil, that God can be seen or can be equated with a sculptor. So if God is a sculptor, occasionally there's going to be chippings and waste as part of his grand plan. And these are the bad things that happen. So Humanitas in this pamphlet says, well, how then would he explain the explosion in Krakatoa, which I suppose was the big story of 1883, in which, a huge amount of the population were killed. And he said, would he describe this as a sprawl? And then he helpfully goes to explain that a sprawl is a trade term for an unusually large chip. And I remember when I read that, I said, yeah, so Humanitas, very familiar with Ireland, and also very familiar with the minutiae of stone carving, and even like the inside terms for different types of chips. So for me, certainly, I think it's very clear that they were one and the same. But as you might imagine, it was vital that nobody ever discovered that James Pearse was publishing these works over in London under this assumed name. Ironically, in the one pamphlet he publishes under his own name, he's actually a defender of the church. He published a pamphlet called A Reply to Professor Maguire's pamphlet, England's Duty to Ireland as it appears to an Englishman. And this was in response to Maguire's pamphlet, which was Ireland's Duty to England by an Irishman, which was published by Maguire, who was a professor of moral philosophy at Trinity College. So I'll just give you the proper title to Maguire's pamphlet was England's Duty to Ireland as Plain to a Loyal Irish Roman Catholic. Maguire is in his pamphlet is very critical and very rude about Parnell and Parnellites and the Home Rule movement. And he describes the Home Rule Party as being members of the Home Rule Party as being wanting in industry, honesty, veracity, self-respect, and cleanliness. And he said that they were characterized, that their supporters were mere oafish lovers of chaos and to be the equivalent of the unsuccessful man at college. So a proper academic there. So the worst thing he can say is men who were unsuccessful at college. But James Pearse, apparently when he read this pamphlet, became outraged, and he said, I'd teach that bloody fellow a lesson. He ought to rinse out his mouth. And his reply is 4 times as long as Maguire's original pamphlet, and he takes on his argument phrase by phrase, and it's full of kind of references to other writers and thinkers, people like Polybius, Gaius Gracchus, Tiberius Sempronius, Addison, the Irish historian Thomas D'Arcy McGee, Gladstone, and John Bright. And some people have said that, James Pearse comes across as somewhat pompous in this pamphlet, but I think and that he's kind of anxious to show his own learning. But I think you have to also remember the inequality in terms of his position as a self-educated craftsman, and this professor of moral philosophy in Trinity. And I think he's, anxious to show that he is. Although he might not have formal education, he is somebody who is capable of intellectual erudition. Apparently, Patrick Pearse was very proud of this pamphlet, and it was something that he treasured. So, and we're very lucky in the Pearse Museum to have the original manuscript. Then just get back to Pearse and Sons in 1890. James Pearse kind of goes out to a certain extent on his own. He sets up Pearse and Sons, though at the time, obviously, Patrick would have been 11 at this stage. So, but I suppose it reflects his aspirations for the family business. So this is, again, a magic lantern slide showing the premises at number 27 Pearse Street. And again, just to give you a sense of like the fact that they're working all over the place, this is a memorial to the Reverend Michael O'Donoghue, which they erected in Arranmore in 1893. And when you look at their accounts, there's stuff going all over the country and also going to Britain. They even supplied an altar to a convent out in Australia. And, you know, even a few years ago, we were, or maybe 20 or 30 years ago, we were donated a piece that came from Bradford. So they're working not just in Ireland, but, you know, they're working internationally to a limited extent. But again, it's interesting as well in terms of Arranmore, which Pearse visits as part of his interest in the Irish language, that his father's work was there ahead of him. And now I suppose we come to the Church of the Immaculate Conception in Strabane. Thank you very much for kind of bringing this altar to our attention in the museum, because we're really interested in just kind of tracking where his work ends up. This would have been a really big commission. According to the documentation that you have, he did the high altar and two side altars around 1895 when the church opened, presumably because I always assume that something like an altar would have to have been in place before they opened. They could have got away without the pulpit, but maybe not the altar. So this is very kind of typical of the kind of work that they're doing. Again, in this much wider image, you get to see, I suppose, the altar as it may have originally appeared. What you find with a lot of these high altars is they get ripped out after Vatican II. So congratulations for that it has survived in Strabane. And of course, originally in the Tridentine rite, you wouldn't have had I suppose, the altar table in front, what we would now consider the altar. So everything would have been focused on the high altar itself. And I suppose, again, something that I would have to look at a lot more now is, I suppose, how the church was reconfigured during the Vatican II period. Certainly the pulpit looks like it's been cut down from something much larger and more elaborate. And again, this is something that you were able to send me. And again, you can see the figures involved. You know, it's £1,150. That's a huge amount of money. Now, and certainly in the account books, you see, like, you know, large amounts of money being paid over for these altars. But again, the costs, the labor costs, the materials, the transport is huge as well. And again, in terms of transport, it's really interesting that the business is located on what is now Pearse Street. So it's kind of very well placed for not alone the station Westland Row, which is now Pearse Station, but also for Amiens Street, now Connolly, and even, you know, Houston and Broadstone. You know, it's that the business is very well placed in terms of not only getting raw materials in, but sending the finished works out. I was able to get a slightly better look, again, due to COVID. I haven't been able to get up to see the work, but it seems to be, the front of the altar seems to depict the Annunciation, which I suppose is very appropriate for the Church of the Immaculate Conception. But I think there's some extra additions here. So I saw the statue, and as far as I can tell, that's Saint Therese of Lisieux, and certainly she would the altar predates her canonization. So this is kind of, I imagine, a later addition to the altar, if I'm right, and that it is her. In this game, you get very good at knowing your saints. So again, you can see this Annunciation. And again, I suppose just to give a sense of the kind of the nature of the work, it is quite generic. So if we go from kind of left to right, you can see these various forms of the Annunciation. And in many ways, the figures are just kind of moved about slightly, but you get often the same lectern. The one at the far end is actually from Athlone, from that pulpit, and the other two are images of works that James Pearse would have photographed. So as I say, it can often actually be very difficult to identify what is James Pearse's work, because if it's not signed or the company's name isn't on it, the idea is that it shouldn't have any specific individuality, that it should have this look, I suppose this kind of Gothic medieval look to it. Now, sorry, I'm just going to skip this one and go on to another piece which was done around the same time as Strabane. This is from 1898. And again, this is a really interesting piece. This photograph shows a rood screen. These are very common in the medieval period, and they separated the altar from the congregation. Interestingly, they were done away with and removed from most Catholic churches after the Council of Trent, which took place after the Reformation. So this is kind of a Renaissance equivalent of Vatican II. And this image this photograph is an original photograph which hung in Pearse's study in St. Enda's, and it was from Cardiff. And you can see here, this is an image of the house when the state took over, and you can see it's hanging in Pearse's study, where we've put it hanging once again. And it would suggest that it was something that was quite significant to Pearse. At the same time, a few years ago, the Heritage Council gave us money to restore an account book for Pearse and Sons from 1898, roughly till when it closed in 1911. And there's a payment here from the Marquis of Bute, and there are a number of payments. So this is the third Marquis of Bute, and he's a really interesting figure, incredibly wealthy in the 19th century. He owned a good chunk of Scotland, a good chunk of Wales, and the bits of Wales he owned were full of coal, which was a good thing to have in the 19th century. And one of the things he owned in Wales was Cardiff. He's in many ways the founder of Cardiff. It was he largely who transformed it from being a small port village to being the city that it is today. He was also a convert to Catholicism, and was responsible for the restoration of Cardiff Castle. But when we say restoration, it's, in many ways, much of it is built by him. And he was a big proponent of the Gothic revival. His interest in Catholicism grew from his interest in the medieval period. He had a very kind of, I suppose, romantic image of the medieval period, and his connection with the spirituality of that period led him to convert to Catholicism. And this is William Burgess, who was an architect who kind of worked with him on many of his projects, like Cardiff Castle. Burgess also did St. Finbarr's Cathedral, the Church of Ireland Cathedral, the last Church of Ireland Cathedral to be built in Ireland. And because the Marquis was a convert to Catholicism, he was a great supporter of the very small Catholic community at the time in Cardiff, and he supported St. Peter's Church in Roath, which was the first Catholic church in Cardiff, and it was built by Webb and Sons significantly from Birmingham. Designed by a man called Charles Hanson. And this is how it appeared in 1870. However, because I think of the Marquis of Bute's interest in the medieval period, he wanted a rood screen. He wanted a return to this older medieval form of Catholicism. And the first rood screen from 1872 seems to have been a wooden one, but then a stone rood screen was commissioned, and it was commissioned, it would seem, from Pearse and Sons. So as you can see, it was an incredibly elaborate piece, and something obviously that James Pearse would have been enormously proud of, and certainly as a show Patrick was proud of as well. Unfortunately, like so much of his work, Vatican II came along, and there's no trace of this this very, very elaborate and very expensive. I think the whole thing cost around maybe £1,400, but it's had a huge commission at the time. But I suppose what's interesting in terms of James Pearse is, if the Marquis of Bute is paying for this, he's only going to have the best. He only did he only had the best in Cardiff Castle. Architecture is something he's passionate about. He's really interested in. He understands. So I suppose when we found this out, it gave us a sense that James Pearse is very much at the top of his game, not just in Ireland, but also in Britain as well. and that the fact that he got this very complicated and difficult commission would suggest that he certainly in the 1890s was a top tier stone carver. And I said, this was a really exciting discovery for us. Now, one of the last commissions that he worked on is not so far away from Strabane. It was the pulpit of the Four Masters for the Cathedral of St. Eunan and Columba in Letterkenny. And this, again, was a big development in the cathedral in Letterkenny. What's interesting about this is that James Pearse actually passed away in the middle of this project. He died on the 5th of September 1900, and it was finished by the company, which was then led by his wife Margaret, and his two sons Patrick and William Pearse. James Vincent Pearse was also involved in the business at this time, but it would seem that there was kind of a family falling out. There seemed to have been issues, kind of a real kind of breakdown between the first, or between not the first and second, but certainly between James Vincent and his father's second family. And again, in terms of the Pearse connection, what's interesting as well is that what's been depicted here are the Four Masters, who aren't, I suppose, part of the general saints that would have been depicted. So Patrick Pearse, who has such an interest in Irish culture and Irish history, is tasked by his father to research how they would have been dressed. And he goes to the Franciscan archives, because one of the Four Masters is a Franciscan monk, to see what evidence they have about medieval dress for Franciscans. And it's very, very interesting to see how, Patrick's interest in Ireland's past and the material culture of Ireland's past is now kind of blending in with the family business. And again, this would have been a real kind of prestige piece for Pearse and Sons, but also, I suppose, something quite melancholic. Interestingly, when James Pearse died, his family stressed in the death notice that he had died fortified by the rites of the Roman Catholic faith in the obituary that they published in the Freeman's Journal. And this doesn't seem to be something that everybody put in. And I think there's a case maybe that the lady doth protest too much in terms of stressing how committed he was to his faith. Pearse himself wrote that he groped faithfully and pathetically to find himself such light as he could, and through great darkness he did find light as his life drew to a close. And again, interestingly, he died while visiting his family in Birmingham, suggesting again that there's very ongoing connection with Birmingham. In fact, in his accounts, there's also evidence, there's clear evidence that he had leased a premises on Bristol Street in Birmingham in the 1880s. So whether he was thinking that maybe he was going to move back to Birmingham, or maybe that he was going to have a branch of his business in Birmingham, we're not quite clear exactly why he had taken on this business at that time. But as I said, the sons kind of continued the business with their mother. And again, interestingly, I think Pearse tries to maybe capitalize on his connection with the world of the Gaelic revival and the Gaelic League. You can see here, this is images they produced for the Cork International Exhibition in 1902, and you can see they had a stand there as well. And if you see, you can see that they have their name in Irish, Muintir an Fíris. And they advertise quite a lot on Clive Sullish, which Pearse becomes the editor of in 1903. And I suppose they're kind of suggesting as well that they are skilled in Irish script and Irish writing and that kind of thing. At the same time, William Pearse is going to art college and I suppose is developing both as an artist and as a craftsman. And you see this kind of blending of the, I suppose, the business and his own artistic ambitions in this piece, which is the Mater Dolorosa for the Mortuary Chapel in St. Andrews in Westland Row. And again, I think this is, compared to the very kind of generic work that the company is producing in the 19th century, this is a very individual, kind of personal piece, and as one that I suppose shows his artistic ambitions. And you can see there's a whole generation, people like, again, I mentioned Harry Clarke, again, the sons and daughters of craftspeople. Albert Power, who was a really good friend of William Pearse as well, he grew up working in the family business and worked himself in the family business, but also pursued a kind of a more artistic career as well, a more individual career. These are some exam pieces that William Pearse produced while a pupil in the Dublin Metropolitan School of Art, what would now be referred to as NCAD. And again, there's a real sensitivity to the work that he produces. And as I said, the family continue the business up until about kind of 1910, 1911. To a certain extent, the business comes under a lot of pressure. It would seem the amount of building may be slowing down a little bit, but also there's a lot of competition from ready-made altars from that are coming in from Italy in particular. I sometimes refer to them as kind of flat pack altars. So you get a catalog. If you're a priest, you get a catalog, and you can pick your altar, and it comes ready made. And in the account books from this period, we see them getting commissions just to install altars that have been produced by foreign companies. And interestingly, Pearse is at one stage kind of involved in a campaign to encourage Irish priests not to be using these kind of more commercial foreign companies, but actually to commission Irish artists to produce work for Irish churches, and that has some success, which is why you find sometimes really nice Harry Clarke windows or Evie Hone work in even some very small churches around the country. But as I said, by 1910, 1911, the business is coming under pressure, but also certainly Patrick's interests, and as a result, the interests of the family have shifted, because in 1908 he has founded his school, Sculptor, which he founds through his work with the Gaelic League. He becomes convinced that the key to the survival of the Irish language is education, and he feels that what is really necessary is the setting up of an Irish-speaking school. And also, I think once he sets up the school, or once becomes involved with the idea of setting up a school, he becomes very excited about the power of education as well. And what he wants to offer is not just an Irish language education, but an education that is distinctly Irish. He also has very radical ideas about education as well, about a child-centered, nurturing education. So he founds the school in 1908 in Collinswood House, his family home, in 1908. And a big part of the school is the idea that it is run by the family. Pearse, when he wants to do something very radical, he often seeks an example in the past. So he said that they are returning to the Irish tradition of fosterage, where one clan would send their son to be reared by another clan. And Pearse was saying, well, this is the same thing. You're sending your children to my family, and they will become part of this kind of wider family. And we are returning to the Irish tradition. In another way, you could say that this is a very radical attempt to offer an education that is nurturing and supportive of children, in contrast to, if you look at, I suppose the other education models, either the very sterile schools being run by religious institutions where boys are very much deprived of any kind of maternal or familial care or kindness, or the kind of almost Darwinian British public school model that you find in places like Eton and Harrow. Pearse is offering something very, very different. In fact, he actually says in the school prospectus that St. Enda's or Scolera is particularly suited because of the involvement of his mother and sisters for sensitive and delicate boys. Something on behalf of all sensitive and delicate boys, I think is a really good idea. In 1910, they moved the school to the Hermitage in Rathfarnham, which is now the home of the Pearse Museum. But what you also start to see is the influence of Pearse's childhood. So he writes in the school prospectus, the internal decoration and furnishing of the school have been carried out in accordance with a carefully considered scheme of colouring and design. The object held in view has been the encouraging in the boys of a love of comely surroundings and the formation of their taste in art. In the classroom, beautiful pictures, statuary and plans replace the charts and other paraphernalia of the ordinary schoolroom. And in some ways, I think what Pearse was trying to do here is recreate this aesthetically rich childhood that he himself had experienced as a young child. And he realizes just how important beautiful things and how important art can be in feeding the imagination of young people. He also commissions contemporary Irish artists. So these are two paintings by Beatrice Elvery, the one of Era with the child sitting on the lap of a woman, I suppose, kind of representing Ireland. That was presented to the school by Maud Gonne. The other image of the young Christ child was commissioned from Beatrice Elvery for the school by Pearse, it would seem. She had earlier illustrated his book, Isagan agus Scéalta Ella. Pearse also, he had his own art collection. So this is The Man Who Buried Raftery by Jack B. Yeats, which hung in Pearse's study. And this kind of artistic atmosphere certainly worked. So among the earliest pupils was Patrick Tuohy, who went on to become a very significant Irish artist in the 1920s. I suppose the other thing to mention as well is that James Pearse's library, that amazing library of books, a lot of these books end up in the school library. So we have some that have his signature on it, and then subsequently on Laurelin Scoilíne. The other thing that St. Enda's becomes known for is its dramatic works. And again, what's really interesting about these plays, these school plays, is how visually arresting they are. So this is a postcard produced by the school showing two of their big productions from 1909. On the left there you have Eamon Bulfin as Carbara in The Coming of Fionn. Eamon Bulfin fought in the 1916 Rising and is believed to be the person who raised the flag on the GPO. You have Frank Dowling as Cuchulainn. Cuchulainn was a big influence on the school when it was founded in Cullinswood House. One of the boys said that he was mentioned so often that it was as if he was a silent but important member of staff. And then on the right-hand side, then you can see Dennis Gwynn as Fionn in The Coming of Fionn. And during the First World War, Dennis Gwynn was part of the British Secret Service. So quite a range of outcomes for the boys who attended Scoilíne. And again, in terms of the influence of that kind of aesthetic upbringing that Pearse had, they did a really elaborate and apparently very kind of artistically sophisticated and almost avant-garde production of the Passion Play, the story of Easter in 1911. You can see here William Pearse plays Pilate, but again you can see the influence as well of those images. You can, the influence of this presentation in terms of all that kind of religious carving that they would have grown up with in their families, in their father's works yard. Again, you have Mary Bulfin as the Virgin Mary in the Passion Play. And I thought it was kind of interesting this is the statue of the Virgin Mary from Strabane. So I'm not 100% sure if it is from the side altar, then possibly carved by James Pearse. But again, you can see how this kind of influenced the presentation of this Passion Play, which was performed in the Abbey Theatre in 1911 by the pupils of Pearse's boys' school, Scoilíne, and his short-lived girls' school, Scoilíne, which lasted from 1910 to 1912. And again, William Pearse, who I suppose had this artistic training, was very much involved in the production of these plays. What's really interesting here is you can see this drawing for it looks, there's notes on the margins talking about Con of 100 Battles, and Nile of the Nine Hostages. And this is actually a sketch based on, it's a sketch based on a book belonging to James Pearse, which was a book of engravings showing a statuary in the throne hall in Dresden in Saxony. So it's really interesting how they're just kind of adapting this stuff and almost creating this Irish culture, or this representation of Irish figures from, you know, these rich resources of kind of medieval sculpture, and also 19th century interpretations of historical figures. And again, you know, you can see this really aesthetically rich productions, and the almost sculptural quality of a lot of the plays is really interesting. You know, and these are sometimes referred to as tableaux vivants, like, you know, these kind of living pictures. And these would have been presented to the world at these open days. They call them they had an annual Éireacht, which was an open day where they would have plays and performances and music and other demonstrations, and the great and the good of the Irish cultural revival were invited. So in the audience here, Eamon Kent is present. Douglas Hyde can be seen. He's very prominent there with his flat cap. And in the middle of them all, then you have Patrick Pearse. However, there's also one interesting thing, I think, in terms of James Pearse's influence on his son Patrick, is that kind of unease that I spoke about at the beginning when we were talking about the strange thing that I am. And he wrote, Pearse ran a short-lived Irish language newspaper called An Báir Bua in 1912. And in the paper, he used to write every edition for the length of its run. He wrote these open letters to prominent figures in Irish politics and culture. So he wrote one, for example, to Douglas Hyde, and one to Owen MacNeill, and he wrote one to himself. And this is the one he wrote himself, and this is a translation, because they are all written in Irish. And he says, "I don't know if I like you or not, Pearse. I don't know if anyone does like you. I know full well many who hate you. Pearse, you are too dark on yourself. You don't make friends with the Gaels. You avoid their company. When you come among them, you bring a dark cloud with you that lies heavily on them. Is it your English blood that is the cause of this, I wonder?" And I think that's, again, is really interesting how he associates his social awkwardness. He goes on to say that he only feels comfortable amongst his pupils in St. Enda's or on a public stage. And there's numerous accounts of just how awkward Pearse was in social situations, how he didn't enjoy small talk or felt uncomfortable. One of the really interesting things, I think, you know, Pearse is famous for his profile, and partly the reason he's always photographed in profile is he had a turn in one of his eyes, or a squint, I suppose, and when he was photographed, it was often in a formal situation, so he was able to, I suppose, disguise it by turning to the side, like so. But what I became curious about was why, even when he's in a snap, like, you know, where he's not aware that he's been photographed, you just still see him from in profile a lot of the time. And apparently he used to hold his head to the side, and, you know, seems to have not made eye contact quite a lot with people. So there is this kind of, I suppose, this kind of sense of reserve, and he's very ill at ease with people. And it's really interesting that he associates this with his Englishness. And then again, it's really interesting to remember his description of his father as this kind of slightly melancholic, slightly depressive figure. And I think Pearse is somebody who struggles quite a lot with his identity, and I think that is very significant in fueling his involvement in the revolutionary struggle subsequently, in terms of his personal motivations. I suppose the other thing worth mentioning in terms of his father is the appearance of figures who either lose their faith or lack of faith. So in Isagan agus Scéalta Ella, which he produces in 1906, in the title story, it tells the story of old Matthias, who's this old man living in the west of Ireland, who has lost his faith. He doesn't go to mass anymore, and this child appears in the village called Isagan, and he's this kind of tiny angelic child, and eventually it emerges that Isagan is actually the Christ child who's come amongst them, and as old Matthias gets older, he becomes ill, and he's kind of on his deathbed, and they send for the priest, but he is reconciled with God through the intervention of Isagon, who appears before him. And again, in some ways, I always think it's a very kind of almost it's not the way a very conventional Catholic, I think, would have written that story. But again, it's really interesting that you have the central character that struggles with belief and religious faith. And similarly, the hero of the singer, MacDara, who in many ways I think is Pearse's idealized self, leading Pearse's idealized rebellion, which in the singer takes place in the west of Ireland amongst an Irish language, Irish speaking community. MacDara describes he heads off at one point in his youth and kind of wanders for many years, and he talks again about losing his faith and gaining his faith. Interestingly, again, he gains his faith without the intervention of a priest or a church. It's a personal reconciliation with God. And again, I think this is quite interesting in terms of, certainly in terms of Pearse's own faith. Pearse is obviously a very different figure than his father. Pearse has very, very strong faith in religion. In many ways, he kind of comes to identify very closely with Christ and the idea of kind of sacrifice, very famously. But again, it's really interesting to see, I think, echoes of his father's influence on him. And then also in terms of James Pearse as this kind of prolific pamphleteer under a pseudonym, remarkably, in the first few months of 1916, before the Rising, Pearse publishes 5 different pamphlets, 4 of which outline his, I suppose, his political vision, and in many ways offers a historic contextualization for the 1916 Rising, which is about to happen. And it's really interesting that this is something that he turns to. And again, I think even if he wasn't aware of quite how many pamphlets his father wrote, he certainly had that experience of the one that James Pearse did publish under his own name. And then again, in terms of the 1916 Rising, in some ways, James Pearse is very much eclipsed by the story of Pearse's mother, and a lot of that is based around the idea of these poems that Patrick Pearse writes for her prior to his death, and I suppose she then almost becomes mother of the nation, the mother of not one but 2 dead sons, 2 sons executed after the 1916 Rising. But again, what's really interesting about this poem is apparently she asked Patrick to write these poems for her. And she asked him to write these poems in her own voice. And what she references when she asked him to write these poems of comfort for her, so she'll have something after he's dead. Nobody expected William to be executed at that point. She references James. She said, "Can you write me a poem like your father did when my sister died and when my father died?" And in our collection, we have a manuscript of a poem written in Margaret Pearse's voice, but in the handwriting of James Pearse, which is her lamenting the death of her father. And we also have this poem, which was they obviously got printed up and framed. And again, it's written in the voice of Margaret Pearse as a sister lamenting the death of her sister Kate in the 1880s. So interestingly, this poem, which in many ways has cemented Mrs. Pearse as the only parent of Patrick Pearse, is inspired by something that James Pearse did. And again, as I said, in the years that followed, she becomes this hugely important symbolic figure. She is the mother of the nation. This is her arriving in Dáil Éireann in 1922. When people are quoting from the treaty debates, when she says that she has to vote against the treaty because she's afraid that the ghosts of her sons would haunt her, this is a really powerful moment. Here she is in 1924 on a fundraising trip of the United States. And again, she's really fated as this very significant figure, this symbolic figure, the mother of the nation. This is her in 1931. This is the launch of the Irish press on the 5th of September, coincidentally, the anniversary of the death of James Pearse in 1900. And she turns on the presses of the Irish press, and the very first copy of the newspaper that comes off the presses is given to her, and that's in her collection today. We have the first ever Irish press. And then when she dies, in some ways, that role is taken by her older daughter, Margaret. And she continues that role. And in many ways, they present Pearse as a very traditional figure, very conventional, Orthodox, Catholic, pious figure. And in some ways, I think in terms of our perception of Pearse, or certainly the image of Pearse in the early years of the new state, as this very conventional Irish Catholic boy, very pious, very observant in terms of his religious views. Much of this, I think, is based on the Pearse that they knew, and in many ways, I think James Pearse, this radical atheist, this Englishman, presented a somewhat problematic aspect of Pearse's history for those who kind of wanted to see Irish history maybe as something much more black and white, or I suppose in this case, green and orange. But in some ways, I think if we look at Pearse as this kind of hybrid production, hybrid result of the mixture of two cultures, and in many ways, this kind of Pearse who is interested in ideas of belief and non-belief, and is much more open to kind of very radical ideas, and has been nurtured on these radical ideas. I think we find certainly a Patrick Pearse who's much more interesting than sometimes the more saintly image that has been traditionally presented of him. So that's it for me, and apologies for talking for so long. Okay, thank you very much.